Hello, everyone. I am Mer Meitzelfeld, Peers Institutional Giving Manager, and I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar, Climate Change, Governance in the Trump Administration, Why Action Matters More Than Ever. This webinar is presented as part of Bard College's Worldwide Climate and Justice Education Month with partners at the Environmental Protection Network. Thank you so much for being here. Today, we'll be discussing a diverging trend: accelerating global warming on the one hand, and the dismantling of science and abandonment of U.S. climate policy on the other. Why does this matter so much now, and what actions can we take as individuals and groups to make a difference in the coming years? This webinar is being recorded and will be shared with participants after the live event, along with the presentation slides. Before we take a look at the agenda, we'd like to learn more about the audience joining us today. Please take a moment to respond to our poll question: how would you describe yourself? And we'll give everyone just a few seconds to choose a response. All right, can we show the responses, please? Okay, we have 3 current government employees, 12 former government employees, 1 person from media, 9 students or educators, 6 nonprofit employees, 3 private sector employees, 19 concerned citizens, 11 retired, and 3 who identify as other. All right, great. Can we go to the next slide, please? Our agenda for today will start off with Dr. Kyla Bennett, Director of Science Policy at PEER, who will tell us about recent climate science and why action to combat climate change is urgently needed. Joseph Goffman, former Assistant Administrator at the Environmental Protection Agency's Office of Air and Radiation, will give an overview of recent U.S. climate policy, including the implications of the Trump administration's recent repeal of the endangerment finding for greenhouse gas emissions. Tim Whitehouse, PEER's Executive Director, will share PEER's perspective on why governance is critical for effective climate policy and the clean energy transition. Peter Murchie, Senior Director of Policy at the Environmental Protection Network, will discuss ways EPN is defending the Environmental Protection Agency's mission, elevating science and expert voices, and mobilizing community-based climate action. After the presentations, we'll have a brief panel discussion about what will the future bring and why action still matters. We will have time for open Q&A after the panel discussion. If you have a question, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to submit questions throughout the webinar. Click thumbs up to upvote questions you're interested in. We won't be monitoring questions through the chat, but rather through the Q&A. And with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Kyla Bennett, Director of Science Policy at PEER, and the other speakers can turn their cameras off.
Thanks for the introduction, Mer, and thank you all for joining us today. Can we have the first slide, please? Before we can talk about climate change and authoritarianism, we all need to be on the same page with the current science on climate change. And the bottom line is that climate change is here, it's getting worse, and it's caused by humans. And I just, before I got on this webinar, checked the daily CO2 in the atmosphere, and we are above 430 parts per million. The last time we had this much carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, it was 3 million years ago. Next slide, please. So in the past year and a half, in 2025 and 2026, disturbing new research has come to light. First, a 2026 meta-analysis, and that's just a review of all the analyses on a topic that have already been done, showed that 99% of sea level studies used the wrong data, which severely underestimated the impacts of sea level rise. What does this mean in practical terms? 1 meter of sea level rise will now result in 31 to 37% more land being underwater and 48 to 68% more people falling below sea level. Next slide, please. Second, the rate of warming has accelerated beyond what we thought, and how fast temperature rises is really critical. A new study showed that when the influence of El Nino events, volcanic eruptions, and regular solar variations are removed from data, a statistically significant acceleration of global warming has been occurring since the year 2015. Everyone thought that things were pretty steady, but that is not true. We are accelerating at a much faster rate. What does this mean in practical terms? It means that the Paris Climate Accord did not work. It was not enough. Next slide, please. Third, new research shows that the AMOC, the ocean current that brings warm surface water north while bringing deep, cold water south, is weakening. What does this mean in practical terms? Everyone thought it would not happen, or if it did happen, it was going to happen in 2050, 2070, but it's already starting to happen. This could bring about abrupt and drastic climate change, leading to more sea level rise and a mini ice age in the EU. Next slide, please. One thing that's really critical to know is that climate change is not the problem to be solved. Rather, what we're dealing with right now is something called a polycrisis, many crises that are interrelated. Climate change is just one symptom of ecological overreach, which is a fancy term for humans using too many resources on a planet of finite resources. One inextricably linked result of ecological overreach is the loss of biodiversity. This chart I find absolutely horrifying. It's just mammal biomass on Earth. Only 5% of mammals, both terrestrial and marine, comprise mammalian biomass on Earth right now, which means that 95% of mammalian biomass on Earth are humans and domesticated animals, particularly those that we eat, cows, sheep, pigs, but also our pets, dogs, horses, and cats. Next slide, please. So what are the other aspects of ecological overreach other than rising temperatures and the loss of mammalian biomass? Land use change, converting intact ecosystems into built landscapes, chemical pollution, loss of fresh water. Our groundwater is being depleted at an astonishing rate, and insect apocalypse. Why should we care about things like insect loss? If we lose bees, for example, our best pollinators, there are other species that pollinate bats, wasps, moths, things like that, but bees are our best pollinators. We could face severe food shortages as they pollinate 67% of agricultural crops. If we lose keystone species, an organism that holds an ecosystem together, humans could actually go extinct. So as you listen to today's speakers, please keep in mind that solving climate change is not enough. We need to halt ecological overreach, which means we must do much more than simply decarbonizing. Thank you.
Thank you, Kyla, for sharing that important and sobering information. Now I'd like to welcome Joseph Goffman, former Assistant Administrator at the Environmental Protection Agency's Office of Air and Radiation.
Thank you. And first of all, I want to thank everybody who's in the audience for joining this call, and also thank Peer for co-organizing it or really organizing it. I'm here in my capacity as a volunteer with the Environmental Protection Network, and you'll be hearing from one of our professional staff, Peter Murchie, a little bit later. But what I want to do now, following Kyla's bracing presentation, is bring the focus more narrowly to what the Environmental Protection Agency has been doing for the last 10 or so years and has done in the last several months to address or sabotage climate change policy in this country. Let's go to the next slide. If The Inflation Reduction Act, which Congress passed in 2022, had not been repealed in 2025. Um, you could make the case that the center pillar of US climate policy were the provisions in the Inflation Reduction Act. But since those provisions were repealed, we're back to what I call an accident of history, which is that the Clean Air Act, regulating greenhouse gases as an air pollutant, was really the centerpiece or the foundation stone of US domestic climate policy at the federal level. And it all started with something called the endangerment finding. The next few minutes, I'm going to briefly describe what that is and what it led to in terms of actual regulatory action by EPA under the Clean Air Act, and what the Trump EPA has done, and what that last set of actions by the Trump EPA means. Let's go to the next slide. The endangerment finding was built on an absolute mountain of peer-reviewed scientific evidence, but it was very simple in its punchline. And it was that for purposes of the Clean Air Act, which is the organic statute that regulates air pollution in this country at the federal level, 6 well-mixed greenhouse gases like CO2, methane, hydrofluorocarbons, when mixed together in the atmosphere, are a class of pollutants that present a threat to human health and the environment by dint of the fact that they trigger disruptive climate change. Next slide, please. Once the agency made that finding, which seemed at the time to be not only good science, but common sense, the agency then had the authority under the Clean Air Act to regulate emissions that flowed from the tailpipes of cars and trucks, that is mostly CO2 and other greenhouse gases. And then that in turn led to the regulation of CO2 from power plants and of methane from the oil and gas sector. Cars and trucks, power plants, and oil and gas sector methane are the predominant sources of greenhouse gases in the US economy. There are a number of other sources of greenhouse gases, notably HFCs, but for Clean Air Act purposes and for the purposes of this discussion, we're focusing on the power sector, cars and trucks on the road, and oil and gas operations that generate methane emissions. Next slide, please. Here's where we were at the end of 2024, at the end of the Biden administration. On the books, we had ambitious regulations to regulate or limit or reduce methane emissions from the oil and gas sector. Those were adopted in March of 24. And then in April of 2024, the Biden EPA established standards, or really updated standards, for greenhouse gas emissions coming from the tailpipes of cars and trucks. And let me be a little more specific. These regulations addressed new cars and new trucks. So over the years, as new cars and new trucks were being sold and replacing cars and trucks on the road, the on-road fleet was getting progressively cleaner. And then finally, the EPA established targeted reduction of requirements for fossil fuel-fired power plants. Next slide, please. This is what we thought we would see if the 2024 passenger car rules remained on the books. We'd be seeing over the lifetime of the program, as the on-road fleet was getting cleaner and cleaner, more than 7 billion tons of CO2 emissions prevented. We'd see a 50% reduction relative to the current new car fleet in CO2 from new cars on the road. And if you're a dollars and cents person, you can see that the dollar value of these reductions would be quite significant, both measured in terms of climate benefits and human health benefits. And of course, cars that run on electrification or are more efficient are easier to maintain and give drivers significant fuel savings. And oh, by the way, those fuel savings were calculated when gasoline was a good bit cheaper than it is today and is likely to be in the future. Next slide, please. In 2024, we established a comprehensive program to reduce methane from the oil and gas sector. And in particular, that program not only required new equipment to be installed that operated at much lower methane intensity, but we had an ambitious set of requirements to deal with super emitters, which are considered to be the major sources of methane from the sector and from oil and gas basins, and rigorous requirements to detect leaks and repair them. Next slide, please. We care a lot about methane because as a global warmer or a warming forcer, it's 30 times more potent than CO2. And as you can see, 30% of the warming that's been detected since the Industrial Revolution is the result of methane emissions. So when you're talking about reducing 58 million tons of methane emissions over a 15 or so year period, you're talking about taking away a significant source of climate forcing. Let's go on to the next slide, please. And finally, for power plants, the 2024 rule put the following proposition down. If you were going to build a new natural gas-fired power plant and you were going to run it for a long period of time or run it hard, you had to make major investments in phase one to ensure that it operated with maximum greenhouse gas efficiency, and then in phase two, install carbon capture and sequestration technology. That's for new plants. For existing coal plants, we laid down the similar proposition. If you were going to shut a plant down soon, no requirements. If you were going to run it for a medium term or over a medium term horizon, you had to co-fire coal with natural gas and then retire it by the end of the 2030s. And if you're going to run a coal plant beyond then you had to make a major investment to clean up its CO2 footprint by installing carbon capture and sequestration. Next slide, please. There you can see the benefits of the power plant proposal, or rather the power plant rule. The actual CO2 reductions was smaller relative to the car rules, but still very significant because it was understood to be a driver of really cleaning up the fossil fuel electricity sector. And at the time we promulgated this rule, the IRA and all of its clean energy provisions were still on the books. So these restrictions or these standards were intended to work in concert with that legislation. Next slide, please. Well, here we are. The Trump EPA has withdrawn the endangerment finding and has repealed the tailpipe emission standards for cars and trucks. They've proposed to repeal the standards for power plants, and their action on the oil and gas sector is still pending. We don't quite know what they're going to do for a variety of complicated reasons that we can get into if anyone's interested during the Q&A. But basically, the pillar of Clean Air Act regulation under the EPA, which is the endangerment finding and the car and truck tailpipe emissions rules, has been removed. And we expect that there will be a final repeal of the power sector rules and at least some kind of weakening of the oil and gas methane rules undertaken the next year or two by the Trump EPA. Next slide, please. Uh, I want to emphasize, and we again can discuss this a little later on, the the federal role in climate policy is extremely significant, but it's not an absolute sine qua non. It's the nature of climate change, it's the nature of the sources of greenhouse gas emissions that in our society there can be a lot of highly productive players, including state governments, has been proven over the last several years, as well as local governments. So one message I'd want to leave everybody with is that while we have suffered and will continue to suffer critical blows to our climate policy on a national level, because of the shenanigans of the Trump administration, the Republican Congress, and EPA. There is still plenty of opportunity at the state community level and even in the private sector to continue to make progress on climate change, in the immediate weeks, months, and years. And I think that that's a wrap for for my part of the presentation. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Joe, for that thorough breakdown of climate policies in flux and what this means for public health and climate change. And now we'll move on to Tim Whitehouse, Peers Executive Director.
Thank you, Mur, and thank you, Joe and Kyla, for those sobering presentations, and thank you, everyone, for joining us today. I'd like to give a shout out to our good friends and partners at the Environmental Protection Network and to Bard College for hosting the Worldwide Climate and Justice Education Network. I'm going to talk about why governance matters in our climate fight, that governance and climate change go hand in hand. And I think Joe's presentation on the endangerment finding highlighted that very well. Next slide. Here's a little bit about PEER. I'm just going to breeze through this very quickly. For those of you that don't know PEER, I think how we differ from other organizations is we work with current and former public employees, and we actually represent public employees in whistleblowing cases and in disclosures to Congress and to inspector generals. And our goal is to shine the light on improper or illegal government actions in order to protect the environment and to work to improve laws and regulations. I'm going to be referring to different things throughout this presentation, and there'll be a resource slide at the end of the webinar where you can find access to the documents I talk about. Next slide. So, we're really in unprecedented times in U.S. history. I think anyone on this webinar knows that. We're losing our system of governance. How our country works must be a critical part of any climate discussion. So governance, we need to start thinking about governance in the environmental movement. Many people are. We see what bad governance does. But what I'm referring to is the laws and the regulations and the rules and the processes and the institutions that are used to manage authority, deliver services, and make decisions. And I wanted to highlight until recently, certainly my generation and many generations of Americans have accepted the basic premise that government, while imperfect, should be accountable to the public it serves. And that accountability has been designed for all its flaws to help ensure that government decisions are made lawfully, science is part of the decision-making process, and officials are not abusing the power given to them by the American people. Next slide. To address climate change, in my opinion, our country needs, obviously, sound science. It needs laws, it needs policies, it needs financing mechanisms, it needs enforcement of those laws, and it needs a civil service that's non-political. And I want to highlight voluntary and market-based mechanisms and personal choices are low impact compared to the changes in infrastructure, land use, agriculture, or energy resources needed to address climate change. I wanted to just point to the poster on the right side of this slide. It was made by a wonderful artist for PEER. And it's part of what I hold hope for, and that PEER and other groups played a critical part in pushing back against the proposals in Congress to sell off public lands. And I use that to emphasize that our collective voices matter, and that collective voice is going to be very important in the coming years. Next slide. So this slide can be a bit overwhelming and chaotic, and it seems like every day brings a litany of bad news to those of us that care about the climate. And I think, again, those of us on this webinar know something's terribly wrong. Our government is careening out of control. It's not getting any better. Decisions regarding climate and energy and land policies are being made without regard to laws and regulations or public opinion. And Congress has abandoned its role of providing oversight of the president and federal agencies. And here in this slide are just 4 examples of things that we've worked on that are going terribly wrong. The U.S. Environmental Protection Agency has lost about a quarter of its workforce in the past year. That's true for the National Park Service and many other federal agencies. And this was designed in a way to inflict trauma on federal employees, and oftentimes it was done completely illegally. On the bottom left, as Joe mentioned, the Trump administration has wiped out almost all federal climate efforts, and much of this has been done without any congressional approval, rewriting of laws, or proper regulations. On the top right, you'll see a snapshot of a peer press release on our investigation into how the Department of the Interior is sending money to a private Trump-aligned entity with no authority from Congress. And on the bottom right, you'll see a snapshot of a peer press release into our investigation into why the Trump administration stopped, in violation of the law, offshore wind development that had already been permitted. They did so for, quote, national security reasons, unquote, but without saying what those reasons were. And now that issue is in court. So it's all very overwhelming and confusing, and it's part of the strategy to dismantle the government and climate change programs. Next slide. One issue those of us at Peer and elsewhere are working hard to stop is the administration's effort to return to the spoil systems of government. That's the practice of a winning political party rewarding its supporters with government jobs. You've heard of all to the victor belongs the spoils, and that's where we're moving as a government. So there are political appointees or supporters in every administration, but a return to the spoil system would mean political leaders could now reach deep into federal agencies to remove and replace unknown, unheralded civil servants whose work is critical to keeping our country safe, but whose viewpoints may run afoul of the prevailing political narrative of the party. We are seeing this play out in the administration in the field of climate science, environmental justice, and public health. Well, the spoil system is not well suited for the modern age. It's well suited for corruption, inefficiency, incompetence. And we're already seeing that in the US government on a scale I think many of us wouldn't have imagined a year ago. So Peer's the lead plaintiff. There's a couple of lawsuits mentioned at the bottom. Peer versus Trump regarding what is called scheduled policy career. Peer is the lead plaintiff in this lawsuit with a coalition of unions and labor federations challenging a regulatory effort to make it easier for political appointees to fire civil servants. The second is Peer versus the Office of Management and Budget. Well, inspector generals sort of are the enemy of this administration if they're actually independent, because they root out waste, fraud, and abuse. That's their goal, and they generally do a pretty good job of it. And Peer's part of a coalition of organizations working to defend the Council of Inspectors Generals from a Trump attempt to defund it, even though Congress has authorized funding for it. Next slide. So there's something that's probably not as obvious to many people about what I want to build as a nexus between free speech and government employees. And it's something we're very heavily involved in. And it's a really significant problem. We're representing a number of clients in free speech issues. For example, and the first one there, we're representing EPA employees fired for signing a declaration of dissent and whistleblowing when they signed an open letter to the EPA administrator and members of Congress protesting the politicization of science at EPA, and warning that EPA's actions under this administration were endangering public health and the environment. And some of those folks that signed that letter were fired, others weren't, without a clear reason to to why that happened. So these cases are now before the Merit Systems Protection Board. A second case revolves around the ability of civil servants to participate in civic affairs outside of work. This is truly a frightening case. It actually started in the Biden administration, but if implemented in the Trump administration, would have far-reaching consequences. This involves an employee of the NLRB who, on her own time outside of work, wrote an op-ed without identifying herself as a federal employee. It had nothing to do with her work, asking for greater staffing at a national park near where she lived. And for that, she received a criminal referral. The AUSA decided not to take the case, but also was reprimanded. And that has a terrible chilling effect. And again, under this administration, it would be extremely terrifying. Think about it if the government could go after you for your private civic affairs if you're a federal employee. And that is happening across the federal government now. And those that oppose the administration's policies are being targeted. There's third thing here that's not actually mentioned, but I just want to briefly mention it. We have represented at least one EPA employee who left government when he spoke out on a climate change issue. After he left government, an outside group, an AstroTurf organization, threatened to have his law license revoked. Unfortunately, that threat never materialized, but the overall message is for federal employees, your free speech rights are limited, be quiet. And that's part of the authoritarian slide that's happening in this country. Next slide. So this just the last slide is we have to turn the corner together. I just want to emphasize before we turn it over to Peter is the civil service, government, environment are all entwined, and we'll work on this together. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim, for that illustration of why good governance is so critical for helping the U.S. address climate change. Now I'd like to welcome Peter Murchie, Senior Director of Policy at the Environmental Protection Network.
Thank you so much, Mur, and we appreciate and thank Pierre and Bard for co-hosting this important webinar today, and to all of you participating and caring, and I can see from the chat, doing a lot around these important issues. Thank you also to Kyla, Joe, and Tim for doing such a great job of providing an overview of the existential and real crisis around climate, the subversion of government policies and science to undermine our efforts to address it, and the attack on the institutions, governance, and public service that are needed for both now and in the future. My role today is to provide an example of what organizations and individuals are doing and can do to both push back in the moment while also thinking about the future. The Environmental Protection Network, next slide, please. The Environmental Protection Network was founded in January 2017 in the first Trump administration and now has over 750 EPA alumni across the country volunteering their time to protect the integrity of EPA, human health, and the environment. We harness the expertise of former EPA career staff and political appointees from both Democratic and Republican administrations to provide the unique perspective of former federal civil servants with decades of historical knowledge and subject matter expertise. Like most everything related to environmental health and climate, these should and really are nonpartisan issues. Next slide, please. We are focused on building and defending the capacity of the Environmental Protection Agency and other environmental agencies and the communities they serve to truly address the most urgent environmental health issues. We work to ensure that the EPA advances policies, budgets, and institutional changes to address environmental justice and climate change, as well as other pressing public health needs. We provide capacity building technical assistance and training to frontline communities, nonprofit organizations, and to under-resourced state, local, and tribal government agencies. Next slide, please. We provide pro bono support to civil servants and former civil servants, in many cases partnering with peer, as Tim mentioned. And we educate Congress and serve as a critical resource for facts, objective analysis, and scientific rigor for reporters and other strategic partners that are trying to tell the important story of environmental health and the role of EPA. Next slide, please. We are especially focused on growing our programming in response to the assault of this administration, both on the policies and programs of EPA, but also the people, its scientists, engineers, policy experts, and others who work with passion to implement the mission and statutory authorities of the agency with both objectivity and a dedication to their service. A vital service to protect and improve environmental health for all Americans. Some examples of those impacts include greater threats to communities, sea level rise and melting permafrost in Alaska, extreme heat and cold, especially impacting urban and rural communities with poor infrastructure and resources to deal with those stresses. Changes in water flows that is impacting water availability and quality, along with our important agricultural sector. But there's a double whammy here, in that this Trump administration and the policies that they're pushing forward or pulling back are making it harder for us to mitigate further climate change, as has been mentioned before by other speakers, while also terminating financial programs and grants and other technical and policy support for those very communities that are going to be impacted the most and first in their own ability to build their own resilience for climate change that they're already seeing. Thank you. We can stop sharing the slides now. So the following part of...
Oh, go ahead, Peter, sorry.
The following are more details about our work at EPN, most of which we are doing with key partners like PEER. From the formation of EPN, we have focused on national environmental policy work. EPN is pushing back on the administration and holding them accountable through policy review, commenting, providing testimony, supporting litigation, and educating decision makers and the public. Between January 20th, 2025, the start of this administration, and the end of the calendar year, EPN submitted 22 formal comments and provided testimony at 5 public hearings. A few examples of our work in the last year related to the conversation today include submitting comments to the Office of Personnel Management, strongly opposing their proposal to reclassify what constitutes policy-making positions in the federal workforce, which Tim and Pierre are very active in. We submitted comments urging EPA to withdraw its proposal to repeal the greenhouse gas reporting program, citing threats to transparency, policymaking, industry stability, and climate accountability. And as Joe discussed earlier, EPN submitted formal comments to EPA regarding the agency's proposal to rescind the 2009 endangerment finding and vehicle greenhouse gas standards, calling the proposal unlawful, scientifically flawed, and economically harmful. We are also helping others provide substantive comments, partnering with groups like Lawyers for Good Government to provide templates and assistance for other groups to analyze and provide their own comments on rules and policy making at the agency. What are we seeing now? Well, we're seeing a transition from new rulemakings, we know they'll do some more, but to the finalization of those rules and the move by partners out there that want to push back to take it to the courts. EPN and others are building our capacities to focus and provide support for those litigation processes with partners like Earth Justice and others. Another priority area of work for us is civil service resilience. In this growing initiative, we support current and recently separated staff by providing resources and guidance for federal employees, including open enrollment opportunities in the environmental sector and job placement. We provide virtual programming and offer one-on-one mentoring to current and former staffers. We continue to educate university students on climate careers at federal, state, local, and non-governmental organization levels to ensure climate science continues and to prepare to backfill vacancies that we know we'll need to do in the future. We are also supporting EPA scientists by providing fellowships to continue the research they were doing while they were at the agency. Another cornerstone of our mission is to provide pro bono capacity building technical assistance to communities. non-governmental organizations, and state, local, and tribal agencies that are especially disproportionately impacted by environmental and health issues and policies. EPN's network of volunteers assist organizations to more effectively and meaningfully participate in government decision-making by helping them navigate EPA and other government processes, help them think through potential grants and grant writing, and to, in general, help them think about data and other tools that could help their own work for their communities. Sadly, this support is needed more than ever as this administration attacks environmental justice programs and our climate change programs and policies. This includes terminating grants to states, tribes, and community groups focused on climate change and environmental justice. Since January of 2025, we have responded to over 1,250 technical assistance requests. And since the inauguration of this new administration, with our partners, Lawyers for Good Government, we have provided grant compliance and legal support to more than 400 entities that have been facing illegal grant terminations. For all of our efforts, it is very important that we all think about audiences and reaching those audiences to continue to tell this story. Apologies. EPN continues to work to inform and educate both national and local media utilizing our EPN volunteers. Further, we have been developing additional outreach and education strategies to better raise awareness and tell the story of the importance of clean air, water, and land, and EPA's important role in ensuring healthy communities across the country. We started in North Carolina, creating an action network of former EPA civil servants who are doing local media, op-eds, town halls, and other efforts to raise awareness. We will be continuing to develop these networks in other states over the next few months. But EPN is only one of many organizations and groups working to push back now, while also thinking about the future of what should be. We are humbled and excited to be part of this panel and conversation with all of you on both the importance of these issues, but also the charge to take action for the change we want and need. I am reminded that there is always going to be change. To be able to ensure that change is what we need, especially around climate and environmental justice, is more important than ever that we look for ways to be involved with our ideas and our actions. Looking at your chat comments, it is clear many, if not all of you, are already taking up that charge. If you're a former federal employee, there are many organizations like EPN that you can join or volunteer with. And for others, you may be sharing it with each other. There are groups that you can join or follow, like Citizens Climate Lobby and 350.org, that can give you a space to take your own actions. Either way, thank you for participating today. It's very inspiring to see. Back to you, Mer.
Thanks, Peter, for sharing all the amazing work that EPN is doing. And thank you to all the speakers. If we could have all the speakers turn their cameras on, we'll get started with the panel discussion. All right, so the question we have for the panel is, given all this insanity that's happening with the government, with the climate, what will the future bring? And why is it so important that we still take action? Why does action still matter? And we'll follow the order of the speakers. So Kyla, we'll start with you.
Sure. So the situation is indeed dire. But if we give up and stop developing solutions, the only outcome is the worst possible one. So every fraction of a degree that we can keep the temperature down helps. But please know something. We will not recover from this. In other words, we will never bring the world back to the way it was decades ago. If we stop burning fossil fuels tonight, we're still going to have 430 parts per million of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere for hundreds of years before it slowly starts coming down, which means we will still have the wildfires, the hurricanes, the droughts, the floods. So the goal is no longer restoration of what was. The goal now is to give us time to figure out how best to survive, how to save as many species and ecosystems as we can. And one of the scientists that I follow on Twitter, his name is Lyle Lewis, he relates this to giving CPR to a patient. The Earth is our patient, and we need to give her CPR. Lyle says CPR does not guarantee survival, but the decision to perform it is rarely debated. It keeps the door open, however narrowly, to a different outcome. So I feel like we have to keep that door open, however narrow it may be, and we have to keep hope and we have to keep fighting to save as much as we can.
Thank you, Kyla. It's important to hear how every action we can take to curb global warming matters. Joe, would you like to share your perspective?
Yes, I think if you remember one thing from this session, remember what Kyla just said, that each increment of warming matters, because each degree or half degree change in climate has real costs and real consequences. Climate change is a force multiplier of human and ecological suffering. It's a force multiplier of the factors that make people sicker than they need to be or face untimely death sooner than they have to. It's a force multiplier to destruction of forests. It's a force multiplier to the risk of forest fires and the risk of severe destructive and deadly weather disruptions. So if you're looking at this force multiplier and you can shave at least some increments off of that force, then you're actually improving the prospects for human health and human well-being and ecological preservation. So that's why actions matter. All this really work turns out to have significant concrete effects.
Thanks, Joe. Tim, please let us know your thoughts.
Yes, thank you, Joe and Kyla. Obviously, I can't predict the future. I wish I could. One observation I'd like to leave folks with is that things are changing so rapidly in our world, whether it's climate change, whether it's governance, whether it's space technologies. And it can seem very overwhelming for someone that's working on such a complex problem as climate change. But I think we just, as Joe and Kyla mentioned, every increment counts, and we need to lean into what we're doing now more than ever. Now is not the time to get overwhelmed or to feel that you're powerless. We just need to lean into what we're doing.
Absolutely. Thanks, Tim. Peter?
Yeah, well, ditto to everything that's been said. I think I'm going to focus a little bit because I think we have quite a few students or early career folks. And I just want to acknowledge it's a very stressful time, both in all the things we've just talked about, but also for folks thinking about their careers. But I want to reemphasize that we need folks coming into these fields of science and policy and advocacy and public affairs more than ever. And that change that we've talked about, the work that Tim and Pierre and others are doing about making sure we're defending and supporting public service and what it needs to be, we're going to need great people that think about this as a career space and want to come back into government and be those public servants. And so I know it seems hard to think about right now, but it's all important to have you think that way and for us to support you in thinking about those career options of public service.
Great. Thanks, Peter. So we have about 9 minutes for Q&A. As a reminder, you can use the Q&A button to ask a question. And if you're interested in a question that's already been asked, you can click the thumbs up to upvote the question. So we're going to get started with a question that came in from Leslie for Joe. She would like to know are there examples of state laws and policies that don't conform with the EPA rollback on tailpipe and power plant emission standards?
Should I go ahead?
Go ahead, yeah.
That's a really, really complicated question now, at least if you look at it from a legal point of view. you know, the by and large, the way the law set up in the before times, the role of the federal government and states, was pretty precisely allocated. And in particular, when it came to cars and trucks, states that followed California's prerogative to set its own standards could set tighter standards for tailpipe emissions for all pollutants from new cars and trucks. The EPA has clearly tried to upset that arrangement because it's so comprehensively hostile to climate policy and to various forms of clean energy that it and other parts of the Trump administration are trying to preempt or take away California and other states' roles in the transportation sector. Meanwhile, in the electricity sector, the center of gravity is not really in Washington. It's in state capitals and it's in cities, municipalities, and counties as well. So try as the Trump administration no doubt will to take those powers away. That's really where, well, again, on the electricity side, the action has long been, continues to be, and needs to be intensified. At the end of the day, when the federal government makes policy, it's often after states and local governments and communities have taken the lead and gotten out ahead of the federal government. So whatever optimism or pessimism you have about the federal government reentering this effort constructively, it's critical to keep working at the state and community level.
Great. Thank you, Joe. And another question you meant during your talk, Joe, was from Chelsea. Could you please elaborate on the pending action regarding the rollback on oil and gas sector methane regulations?
Oh yeah, that's a really complicated story because, to be blunt, for a variety of legal reasons, political reasons, and the industry's own preferences, the EPA is kind of boxed in. And it would probably take me about 10 minutes to explain all the walls of the box. But it's telling that we haven't seen anything by way of the kind of proposal that they made on power plants or the final action that they took on cars and trucks in the oil and gas sector. They're again, that mostly it's an accident of history or an artifact of the history of the last 5 years, particularly through congressional action and positions they've taken on other Clean Air Act rules, that for the moment they're kind of stuck and they're not getting by any means universal industry support for repealing the methane rules.
Thanks, Joe. It's very
I'm happy
complicated
to
indeed.
take the conversation offline. People really are masochistic enough to examine all the walls of the EPA box.
Great. All right. So this is a question from Connie for Tim. Is PEER working with the National Resources Defense Council, NRDC, and/or Earth Justice?
Yes, we work with both groups. Currently, we're working with unions, private sector law firms. Earth Justice has submitted an amicus brief in one of our cases. We consult regularly with the major environmental groups, and I think NRDC has a really strong depth of knowledge, particularly on issues like chemicals, which we work on. So yes.
Great, thanks. Another question for you, Tim. This is also from Connie. So if you are a federal employee, can or will the government come after you if you attend a No Kings rally, even if you don't identify yourself?
So the government should not, under any conditions, go after you for attending a No Kings rally if you're a federal employee and you don't identify yourself as such. And so that's one of the free speech issues that we're monitoring and that we care about. Unfortunately, there is overreach in the government and they are trying to squelch dissent, but that should be your First Amendment rights. You should be able to do that on your own time and not identifying yourself as speaking for the government.
Great, thanks. All right, so this is a question for Kyla. What are the solutions to ecological overreach other than decarbonizing the power sector?
Sure, that's an interesting question. There are a lot, I mean, I'm kind of torn because I hate to shift the burden of action to individuals as opposed to governments because we really need governments to take bold action moving forward. So because we've lost so much under this administration, so much time, so much science, so many scientists, so many laws, fighting for the status quo isn't enough. We need really bold changes. So, on an individual level, think about eating less meat and dairy. That is one of the biggest actions that anybody can take, actually. Also, work at the local and state levels now, since the federal government is very difficult to work with. A lot of towns have grants for climate change, and you can work with them to do things locally in your town, fight against big projects, especially AI centers, which use up a lot of water and a lot of electricity. So there are many, many things that you can do at the local level, at the state level, and as an individual in your own household. That being said, please remember it is definitely our government's burden. So vote carefully. It's really important for us to get people who are willing and able to take bold action once we get ourselves out of this current mess.
Great, thanks, Kyla. This question is from Jeannie, and it was also upvoted. This is for Joe. Will it be possible to reinstate the endangerment finding? Is there a better way to go about this in the future?
It may be possible. What's unfolding now is a challenge to the withdrawal of the endangerment finding in the DC Circuit Court of Appeals. And what's going to be contested there is whether or not the current EPA's view of the Clean Air Act is correct, that the EPA doesn't have authority to make an endangerment finding, or whether the current interpretation of the Clean Air Act that the EPA offered is one that the courts agree with. If the EPA wins that case and gets a ruling as a matter of law that its authorities on greenhouse gases are either non-existent or severely limited, then reversing what they've done will be extremely difficult, if not impossible. If, on the other hand, the DC Circuit rejects the argument, and I think there's a better than 50% chance, given the legal precedents, that they will, then a new administration will have the option of reversing a lot of the withdrawal and the endangerment finding and reinstating these rules. So it really comes down to what the courts do. I have to say that I'm guardedly optimistic that the DC Circuit will rule against the agency. But if it goes to the Supreme Court, well, that's a different matter. But again, one thing I want to emphasize is that when you're looking at the energy sector, notably the electricity sector, there are a lot of other tools in the toolbox than Clean Air Act regulation. It's really around cars and trucks, where the Clean Air Act will continue to be needed. And so we're going to have to really hope that the DC Circuit does the right thing and the Supreme Court restrains itself from doing the wrong thing.
Thanks, Joe. And it looks like suddenly we're at the top of the hour. So I know we didn't get to many questions. Sorry about that. But thanks so much, and hope you can continue to engage with us. Can we bring up the slides, please? Yes. So these are the resources that Tim mentioned in his presentation. There are several links to you can learn more about our lawsuits to protect the nonpartisan civil service, government oversight, and the free speech rights of government employees. Next slide. And if you want to support Peer's climate and governance work, please visit our website to make a donation. We rely on public support and institutional giving to provide pro bono legal services to public employees and to carry out our program work fighting for integrity in climate programs. As a reminder, the webinar recording will be available later this week. We'll be emailing that out to attendees along with the slides. Thanks everyone for joining.